August 25th, 1944. Northern France. The night is thick with rain and diesel smoke. Headlights slice through the mist in single file. A line of trucks stretching beyond sight. Engines growling under heavy loads. The ground trembles as thousands of tires grind against broken roads. Each vehicle carries the same lifeblood of war. Fuel, ammunition, rations, everything needed to keep the American advance alive. A few miles east, in a dimly lit command post, German generals lean over a map. Cigarette smoke curls above their shoulders as they study the Allied front. Reports say Patton's tanks are running out of fuel. The Americans, one scoffs, move too fast for their stomachs. Laughter echoes through the bunker. They expect the advance to collapse. Any day now. But out there, in the black fields of France, the hum of engines grows louder. Convoys thunder through the night without pause. Drivers gripping the wheel for 70-hour stretches, pushing faster than the maps allow. Within hours, that laughter would fade. What the Germans didn't know was that America's greatest weapon wasn't a tank or a plane. It was a road. By late summer 1944, Europe was a continent in motion. The Allied invasion of Normandy had broken the back of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. What began on June 6th, D-Day, had now erupted into a full-scale breakout across France. German lines were collapsing faster than their high command could respond. Town after town, long trapped under occupation, saw the stars and stripes or the Union Jack flutter again above shattered rooftops. But victory brought its own burden. Success was happening too fast. General George S. Patton's Third Army, newly unleashed in August, moved like lightning. His tanks spearheaded the drive south and east, cutting across the French countryside in a relentless thrust toward the Seine. Every mile gained demanded thousands of gallons of fuel, hundreds of tons of ammunition, and endless rations. Yet every step forward stretched the supply chain thinner. Behind them, the beaches of Normandy, once the lifeline of the invasion, were now too far away. The French rail network lay in ruins, bombed by Allied aircraft during the weeks before D-Day to cripple German mobility. Bridges had been blown, ports sabotaged, roads clogged with wreckage. Supplies sat in mountain-high piles near the coast, while the men who needed them were hundreds of miles inland. Patton's commanders sent desperate messages to headquarters. Fuel trucks couldn't keep up. Ammunition depots ran dry. In some divisions, tanks had to stop not because of the enemy, but because their engines coughed on empty. The entire momentum of the Allied campaign teetered on a single question: how to feed the fastest-moving army in history. Across the front, frustration boiled. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, faced a dilemma of victory. He had unleashed an army too efficient for its own logistics. The success of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, had shattered German cohesion, but it also shattered Allied planning. Every mile of advance consumed 800,000 gallons of fuel. To move a single division, dozens of truckloads had to reach the line every day. And there were not enough trucks. German commanders watched the chaos unfold with grim amusement. They had seen it before. Armies that outran their supplies, burning out in the momentum of their own success. To them, the Americans were rich, wasteful, overconfident. "They fight with gasoline," one Wehrmacht officer wrote, "and gasoline runs out." But within the Allied ranks, there were those who refused to let the campaign stall. Officers of the U.S. Army's Transportation and Quartermaster Corps began sketching an idea. Desperate, simple, and audacious. If the supply trains could not move fast enough, they would create their own highway, a single-purpose lifeline running from Normandy to the front. The concept defied conventional logistics. It would bypass railroads, ignore normal traffic rules, and run 24 hours a day. Thousands of trucks would drive in continuous rotation, like a bloodstream feeding the body of war. Each convoy would follow a strict route eastward, while an identical stream of empty trucks returned west. No stops, no diversions, no sleep longer than a few hours at a time. It was a plan born not from luxury, but from necessity, and its execution would fall on the shoulders of men rarely mentioned in the grand narratives of the war. Drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and loaders. Most were young. Many had never seen combat. 3/4 of them were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units, denied combat roles but suddenly entrusted with the lifeline of Patton's Blitz. As August drew to a close, orders rippled across northern France. Convoy routes were marked on maps with red circles and arrows, the chosen path of the new supply highway. Its code name came from the railroads back home that marked priority cargo. Red Ball. In the chill before dawn on August 25th, the first convoys assembled in the dust near St. Lo. Engines started one after another, headlights dimmed to slits, radios crackling with final instructions. The drivers tightened their gloves, glanced down the endless line of trucks ahead, and pressed the throttle. The road to victory had just begun to hum. The first miles of the Red Ball Express began as a gamble. No one truly knew if it would work. The plan, drafted in only days, demanded an almost impossible level of coordination. 2 parallel routes, one eastbound for loaded trucks, one westbound for empty returns, would stretch from Normandy's beaches to the rapidly moving front, hundreds of kilometers inland. To keep traffic flowing, military police blocked off crossroads, posted guard points, and set up maintenance depots at intervals. The highway became a living organism, self-contained, self-sustaining, and in motion around the clock. Convoys rolled out every few minutes. By day, the sun glinted off endless rows of olive-drab trucks. By night, only the faint glow of blackout lamps traced their path through the darkness. Each truck carried a painted red circle on its bumper, the mark of the express. Inside, supplies were stacked to the roof. Fuel drums, rations, shells, spare parts, even medical equipment. A single truck could carry enough gasoline to keep a tank battalion moving for a day. And with thousands of them moving in rotation, the system became the artery of Patton's army. The men behind the wheel were often barely trained for what they faced. Many were African-American drivers of the Transportation Corps, soldiers who had enlisted to serve but had been restricted to labor roles due to segregation policies. Now, overnight, they became the difference between victory and stagnation. Working in shifts that stretched beyond exhaustion, they navigated rain-slicked roads, broken bridges, and enemy fire. Sleep was a luxury, meals often eaten behind the wheel. "We just drove," one veteran recalled. Day, night, didn't matter. You'd forget what day it was. As the days passed, the scale of the operation swelled beyond anything the U.S. Army had ever attempted. Within a week, over 6,000 trucks were in motion. Each carried roughly 2.5 tons of supplies. Together, they delivered more than 12,000 tons every day. An astonishing figure for an improvised operation launched in wartime chaos. Command posts buzzed with radio chatter. Dispatchers monitored fuel levels, breakdowns, and accidents. Mechanics worked in open fields, patching engines and replacing tires by lantern light. Every broken truck meant fewer shells at the front, fewer gallons for Patton's tanks. And still, the army moved. Patton's Third Army tore across France with a speed that shocked even Eisenhower's staff. In 1 week, they advanced more than 400 miles, farther than any Allied army in Europe had managed. German resistance fractured. Entire divisions surrendered. The Wehrmacht, unable to regroup, retreated toward the Moselle and the German border. But every mile gained made the lifeline longer and more fragile. The convoys now stretched across a battlefield where the front was fluid and the rear still dangerous. Luftwaffe aircraft prowled the skies, strafing convoys caught in daylight. German saboteurs mined crossroads and ambushed isolated trucks. Drivers learned to travel in tight formation, to never stop on open roads, and to jump clear if their load caught fire. To protect the route, the U.S. military enforced strict discipline. No civilian vehicles were allowed. No detours, no overtaking, no rest stops outside assigned points. The road was sacred. Trucks that broke down were pushed aside, their cargo redistributed within minutes. The rhythm of war depended on it. By early September, the Red Ball Express had become more than a supply route. It was a symbol. Newspapers back home called it the highway that never sleeps. To the soldiers at the front, it was salvation on wheels. Every can of gasoline, every crate of ammunition arriving just in time meant another attack could proceed. Yet, within Allied command circles, there was quiet tension. The system was miraculous but unsustainable. Trucks wore out faster than replacements could arrive. Drivers collapsed from fatigue, and as autumn rains turned French roads into rivers of mud, the miracle highway began to strain under its own weight. Still, there was no other choice. The ports at Le Havre and Antwerp remained closed or under German control. Rail transport was months away from restoration. The entire momentum of the Allied push rested on this makeshift convoy network, on courage, endurance, and the will to keep moving. And so they drove, through night, through exhaustion, through disbelief. Because if the Red Ball Express stopped, so would the war. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a living story of men, machines, and endurance. To understand its power, one must see it through multiple lenses: the human, the tactical, and the moral. Each reveals how an improvised idea became one of the most remarkable logistical operations in modern warfare. The human angle. The forgotten soldiers behind the wheel. Most of the men who made the Red Ball Express move were not celebrated heroes. They were African American soldiers, members of the Segregated Transportation Corps, who had been denied frontline combat but now held the front's fate in their hands. For these men, the road was both opportunity and ordeal. Many came from the rural American South, drawn into the war by a promise of service and dignity. Yet, within the Army, they were confined to menial roles: digging, hauling, loading. The Red Ball Express changed that. Suddenly, they were entrusted with the most vital task in the entire European campaign: keeping Patton's army alive. Driving those trucks was brutal work. The shifts stretched for 20, even 30 hours. Drivers often steered half asleep, gripping the wheel as rain hammered the windshield and shellfire echoed in the distance. Trucks carried 3 or 4 fuel drums lashed together with ropes. A single spark could turn them into infernos. Still, they pressed on. They faced not only exhaustion, but prejudice. Some white officers doubted they could handle the responsibility. Yet, when the convoys started rolling, skepticism turned to awe. "Those boys kept us going," one white officer later said. Without them, Patton's tanks would have been statues. Every night, the roads shimmered with ghostly lights, a convoy of shadows stretching across France. Drivers developed their own signals: a horn blast for a hazard, a hand wave for a pass. When a truck broke down, others stopped to help, even under threat of air raids. They shared cigarettes, laughter, and, at times, fear. By the time the Express reached its peak, nearly 75% of its drivers were black soldiers. They worked with pride, knowing that the outcome of the war, and perhaps their place in history, rode on those tires. But history would not remember them immediately. After the war, their contributions were buried under silence. Their names appeared in few reports, their units rarely honored. For decades, the Red Ball Express was remembered as an engineering miracle, not a human one. Only later did historians uncover the truth that this miracle was driven by men who fought for recognition as fiercely as they fought for the road. The tactical angle, fueling Patton's Blitz while the drivers fought their own war on the road. The generals waged theirs in the map rooms. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than any force in the Western theater. His strategy relied on momentum, constant, unrelenting motion. "Keep moving," Patton said, "and the enemy will never recover." But momentum burns fuel. Each of Patton's armored divisions required 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day just to maintain forward operations. Every delay meant halted tanks, stalled artillery, and disrupted offensives. Traditional supply methods could no longer sustain such speed. The Red Ball Express became the tactical bridge between ambition and reality. It allowed Patton to gamble, to strike deep where others hesitated. In late August, while Montgomery's forces advanced methodically in the north, Patton's units cut through central France, capturing Le Mans, Chartres, and crossing the Seine within days. German units, expecting the Americans to slow, found themselves surrounded instead. Yet the risk was immense. The Third Army's supply columns often extended over 300 miles. A single delay could cascade into paralysis. The Red Ball Express solved this by standardizing its rhythm. 2 routes, no interference, no idle vehicles. Trucks moved at fixed intervals, like a mechanical pulse beating across the continent. Eisenhower himself recognized the system's brilliance. In his later memoirs, he wrote, "The Red Ball Express was the artery of our advance. Without it, the liberation of France would have taken much longer." To the Germans, this efficiency was bewildering. Their own armies relied on horse-drawn wagons and fractured rail lines. They could not comprehend how an enemy could sustain a mechanized force so deep in occupied territory without rail support. One captured German officer remarked, "Your army drives on wheels, not rails." It is like nothing we have faced before. And that was precisely the point. The Red Ball Express represented a new kind of warfare, one in which logistics was not merely support, but strategy itself. Still, the system pushed men and machines to the edge. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and tires shredded on the rough French roads. Mechanics worked without pause. Fuel dumps caught fire. Convoys got lost in fog or ambushed by retreating German units. Every obstacle tested the plan and the will of those who drove it. Yet, day after day, the trucks kept moving. Because every drum of gasoline, every box of rations that reached Patton's spearhead meant another town liberated and another. Step toward Germany's heart, the Red Ball Express had proven that war was no longer won solely by the front lines, but by the hands that fed them. And soon, the system would reveal just how far it could be pushed, when the advance reached its most critical moment. As the Red Ball Express expanded, it became a case study in how war transforms necessity into innovation. Every aspect, from the trucks to the tactics, evolved under pressure. Each mile revealed new angles to a system that, though improvised, would define modern logistics for generations to come. The technological angle, the machines that never slept, the Red Ball Express depended on one machine above all, the 2.5-ton truck, the deuce and a half. Built for endurance, it was simple, sturdy, and expendable. With a straight-six gasoline engine, manual transmission, and an unrelenting appetite for maintenance, it was the unsung backbone of Allied mobility. Thousands of these trucks thundered across France, forming a moving pipeline of steel and rubber. But constant motion meant constant failure. Axles snapped, radiators burst, and tires wore down to bare cloth. Mechanics worked without rest, often in mud, fixing engines under dim flashlights. Replacement parts were scarce, so ingenuity filled the gaps. Broken fan belts mended with rope, tires patched with rags, leaks sealed with chewing gum. Each vehicle carried a precious cargo, often barrels of high-octane gasoline. Drivers joked grimly that if a single German bullet struck the load, they'd go up faster than a Christmas tree. Convoy orders forbade stopping for any reason unless the truck ahead had exploded. The rhythm of movement was survival. To keep the flow efficient, military engineers devised field systems of astonishing precision. Refueling depots were placed every 25 miles. Dispatchers tracked every vehicle using code numbers and colored markers. At night, blackout driving required trucks to follow only the faint glow of the tail lamp ahead, nicknamed the cat's eye. One moment of distraction could cause a chain collision. Yet despite all this chaos, the Express achieved near-industrial regularity. In its first month, it delivered over 89,000 tons of supplies, a feat no army had ever matched under such conditions. For the German High Command, this was unthinkable. Their supply lines depended on fixed infrastructure, rails, depots, horse teams, all vulnerable to Allied airstrikes. The Americans, by contrast, had created a supply network that moved itself. Roads were no longer just routes. They were arteries of war. The lessons of this would echo far beyond 1944. Military historians later called the Red Ball Express a mobile factory, producing momentum instead of weapons. It showed that logistics, when mastered, was not just support, but power itself. The enemy angle, misjudgment and shock for the Germans, the collapse of France in the summer of 1944 was more than defeat. It was disbelief. Their generals had underestimated the Allies' speed, resilience, and most of all, their capacity to adapt. When reports of the Red Ball Express reached the Wehrmacht's intelligence offices, many dismissed them as propaganda. No army, they thought, could sustain such volume on open roads under fire. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, before his death in August, reportedly told his staff, "The Americans attack with their stomachs, not their hearts." He believed logistics would choke them before winter. But the opposite happened. While German armored divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel, American convoys roared day and night. The Luftwaffe tried to target them, but was crippled by Allied air superiority. German saboteurs destroyed bridges, but U.S. engineers rebuilt them within hours. The Red Ball Express proved so fluid that by the time German reconnaissance identified a route, it had already shifted elsewhere. By late September, captured Wehrmacht officers began to realize that their industrial edge, the precision and efficiency once synonymous with the German army, had been overtaken by raw American improvisation. The U.S. didn't perfect logistics. It overpowered it. Even General Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine, later admitted in post-war writings that the Allies had achieved a mechanized depth of movement unmatched in history. What his panzers had once done through surprise, the Americans now achieved through logistics, the moral angle, the road of brotherhood and exhaustion for the men of the Red Ball Express. The battlefield wasn't a front line of trenches or ruins. It was an endless road. Their war was measured not in miles conquered, but in miles survived. Every driver bore the same private fears: fatigue, ambush, mechanical failure, or the sudden roar of a strafing fighter overhead. Sleep-deprived soldiers sometimes hallucinated figures in the fog or saw headlights that weren't there. Convoys rolled through burning villages and silent fields still littered with wreckage from the Normandy campaign. The road itself became a haunting memory, and yet there was a sense of unity that transcended rank or color. White and black soldiers shared rations, guarded each other's backs, and relied on the same courage. "We were all just tired," one veteran said years later. "Too tired to care who you were, just as long as you kept that truck moving." Each journey was a silent pact. Deliver or die trying. Many didn't make it. Dozens of trucks crashed or caught fire. Some drivers simply disappeared, lost to the dark forests of France. Their vehicles found days later in ditches or burned out from air attacks. But those who survived carried pride. They knew they had done something historic, even if history didn't yet know it. For many African American drivers, the Red Ball Express became proof of ability, endurance, and value in a system that had long denied them both equality and recognition. After the war, they would return home to a country still segregated, still blind to their contribution. Yet in the black and white photos of France, their faces endure, weary, determined, illuminated by the glow of truck headlights cutting through the night. They were the heartbeat of an army that refused to stop. By September's end, the Red Ball Express was operating at its peak, a machine of men and metal that defied exhaustion, prejudice, and enemy fire alike. But the greatest test was still to come. Patton's tanks were approaching the German border, and the entire operation was about to be pushed beyond its limits. Early September 1944, Eastern France. Rain lashed against the windshields of hundreds of trucks as they rolled eastward. The roads, once firm in summer dust, had turned into rivers of mud. Engines strained, wheels spun, and drivers fought to keep control as the convoys climbed through the battered French countryside toward the front. Ahead of them, General George S. Patton's Third Army, that unstoppable spearhead of steel, had finally met its greatest enemy. Not the Wehrmacht, but its own fuel tanks. For weeks, Patton's advance had been breathtaking. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of France, his divisions had raced more than 400 miles, cutting deep into German lines. The enemy, stunned by his speed, was retreating in disarray. Paris had been liberated. The French capital celebrated. But victory carried a hidden cost. The Third Army's tanks were now almost dry. At the front, engines began to sputter and die. Entire columns of Sherman tanks stood still. Their barrels pointed toward the Moselle River, but unable to move an inch. Armored crews climbed out, waiting in silence, their confidence fading with every passing hour. Patton himself paced inside his mobile headquarters, furious. "My men can eat their belts," he snapped, "but my tanks have got to have gas." The situation was dire. On September 1st, 1944, fuel deliveries to the Third Army dropped below half the required volume. The High Command in Versailles had diverted resources to Montgomery's forces in the north, preparing for Operation Market Garden. That left Patton starved for supplies. Without immediate resupply, his advance toward the German border would grind to a halt, and the chance to end the war before Christmas would vanish. And so, the fate of Patton's campaign fell to the road, to the Red Ball Express. Orders came from the highest levels. Every available truck, every driver, every gallon of gasoline was to be thrown into the effort to feed the Third Army. The 6th and 7th Quartermaster truck companies were rerouted toward Verdun, their convoys doubling in length. Engineers worked to expand the highway, cutting detours through fields, erecting makeshift bridges, and setting up refueling stations under the constant threat of German attack. The drivers knew what was at stake. They were told simply, "Patton needs gas." No further explanation was required. Day after day, the convoys surged forward, thousands of trucks running nonstop, engines roaring in the night. Each carried an average of 5,000 gallons of fuel, sloshing in steel drums that rattled against the truck walls. Drivers tied scarves around their mouths to block the fumes. Sleep came in 30-minute bursts, if at all. They called it hauling hell. The Germans, sensing weakness, struck back with everything they had left. Luftwaffe fighters strafed the highways, riddling convoys with machine gun fire. Bombs cratered roads. Drivers were killed or burned alive when fuel drums ignited. Still, replacements took their place. The line never broke. In one night alone, more than 2,000 trucks delivered fuel to Patton's divisions, over 1.5 million gallons, enough to keep his spearhead alive for another push. Mechanics and ordnance men worked side by side in the rain, refilling tankers and patching up damaged vehicles. At field depots, soldiers formed bucket lines to roll fuel drums directly into Patton's tanks. There was no time for ceremony, no pause for rest. The front had to move. Meanwhile, in Berlin, reports began filtering in. German intelligence officers were stunned. According to their estimates, the American advance should have halted days earlier. "They are moving without railroads," one analyst wrote. And yet they do not stop. At the Moselle, Patton's armored columns began to move again. Engines roared back to life as convoys arrived in waves, spilling fuel across the front. The smell of gasoline filled the air, the scent of motion, of momentum reclaimed. Tank crews cheered as the trucks arrived, their drivers waving wearily before turning back to the road for another trip. Patton himself later acknowledged that his tanks had been within hours of stopping completely. The Red Ball Express had saved the Third Army, and perhaps the Allied timetable for victory. But this triumph came at a cost. Overwork and fatigue pushed the system to its limits. Accidents multiplied. Trucks crashed on slick roads or overturned on tight corners. Entire convoys disappeared into fog and never arrived. The supply officers called it mechanical attrition. The men called it luck. Still, the road pulsed with life. Over 5,958 vehicles were in constant rotation. Every 15 minutes, a new convoy left the depots at St. Lo, its drivers knowing they might never return. Yet, they went. Because the front was waiting, and Patton was counting on them. The laughter that once echoed in German headquarters had gone silent. They had underestimated the Americans and the road that moved like an army. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a lifeline. It had become the very rhythm of war itself. September 10th, 1944, near Verdun, France. The night was restless. Thunder cracked above the rolling hills, and the wind carried the low growl of engines echoing across the valley. On a narrow stretch of road near Verdun, the Red Ball Express was moving at full throttle. Dozens of trucks, headlights dimmed and covered with blackout hoods, roared through the darkness in a single-file column, a steel artery pumping life into a starving army. Each truck bore a circular red insignia, the Red Ball, painted on its doors and hood. It wasn't just a name, it was a symbol of urgency. Nothing on the road had the right of way over a Red Ball convoy. French villagers learned to pull their carts aside when they saw those painted circles flashing past. Even military police waved them through without question. The drivers, mostly young black soldiers, sat behind the wheels with cigarettes clenched in their teeth, rain hammering against the windshields. Many were barely 20 years old. Some had never driven a truck before coming to Europe. Now they were hauling tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations through terrain littered with wreckage. Private Eddie Carter from Mississippi recalled in his diary, "We drove until our eyes burned. Sometimes we didn't know if it was rain or tears, but the colonel said Patton needed gas, and we weren't about to be the ones who let him down." The road ahead was chaos. Craters from German airstrikes pocked the asphalt. Bridges were half collapsed, patched with timber and planks. Trucks skidded dangerously close to the edges, their tires inches from the drop. The convoy commander's voice crackled over the radio. "Keep moving! No stops, no lights, no turning back." It was an unspoken truth. Stopping meant dying. German fighter planes had begun hunting the convoys. The Luftwaffe might have been weakened, but it still had teeth. Around midday, as one column crossed a clearing outside Bar-le-Duc, the shriek of engines tore through the sky. "Stukas, take cover!" someone shouted. Within seconds, bullets rained down. Trucks exploded like matchsticks, fuel igniting into towers of flame. Men leapt from burning cabs, diving into ditches. Those who survived crawled out, coughing, as medics pulled the wounded to safety. But within hours, the line was moving again. Replacement trucks filled the gaps. The road didn't stop. Not for weather, not for bombs, not for death. Behind the lines, the logistics officers were performing miracles of coordination. Supply depots were operating 24 hours a day, dispatching convoys like clockwork. Mechanics slept beside their vehicles, fixing engines under moonlight. Military police patrolled intersections to keep civilian traffic away. At its height, the Red Ball Express was moving. 2,500 tons of supplies per day, an unimaginable feat for an army that just weeks earlier had been stranded on the beaches of Normandy. Patton watched this miracle unfold with growing awe. His tanks refueled, his artillery rearmed. The Third Army began its renewed push eastward, crossing the Moselle and driving toward Metz. "My men can fight again," he wrote in his journal, because somewhere, out there, a boy with a steering wheel refused to quit. Meanwhile, on the road, exhaustion reached its peak. Drivers were collapsing behind the wheel. Some tied ropes from their wrists to the gear levers so they'd wake if they dozed off. Others taped open their eyelids with cigarette paper. They lived on cold rations, black coffee, and adrenaline. A few never made it. Their trucks found later at the bottom of ravines or wrapped around trees, yet morale stayed fierce. The men painted slogans on their vehicles: "Hell on Wheels," "No Sleep Till Metz," "Patton's Lifeline." They sang songs to drown the fatigue, their laughter echoing in the dark. Despite the danger, there was pride. The quiet, defiant kind that comes from knowing the war cannot move without you. Many of these drivers were part of segregated units, black soldiers serving under white officers. For years, they had been told they weren't fit for combat. But now, they were proving the opposite. Without their skill and courage, Patton's tanks would have stopped dead in the mud of France. Even Eisenhower later admitted, "The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of our armies. Without it, the advance across France would have been impossible." By late September, as the rains worsened and the roads turned to sludge, the convoys began to thin. The Allies had captured new ports along the coast, and railroads were being restored. The Red Ball Express had done its job. But for those who drove it, the memories would never fade. The endless roads, the smell of diesel and fear, the rumble of engines in the night. Private Carter wrote in his last letter home, "They'll talk about the generals, maybe even the tanks, but I hope somebody remembers the roads, because that's where we fought our war." And someone did. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the name Red Ball Express had become legend, a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable rhythm that carried the Allied armies to victory. The road had done its duty, and the men who drove it had changed history. When autumn deepened over Europe in late 1944, the convoys began to slow. The Red Ball Express, once roaring with unstoppable momentum, was finally nearing its end. The reason wasn't failure. It was victory in motion. The Allies had captured ports like Antwerp and Le Havre, and rail lines were being repaired to carry bulk supplies. The road that had saved an army could finally rest. Yet its echoes remained. In the cracked tarmac, in the oil stains, in the memories of men who had lived weeks behind a steering wheel. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had employed over 23,000 drivers and operated nearly 6,000 vehicles every single day. Most of them were young, inexperienced, and black, part of segregated units that had been relegated to support roles. But their performance shocked even the most hardened officers. Despite mechanical failures, air raids, and fatigue, the convoys kept a 90% delivery rate. That meant that for every 10 gallons of fuel Patton demanded, 9 made it to his tanks. The Germans, who had mocked American logistics only weeks before, were no longer laughing. Their own supply system, once the envy of Europe, was crumbling under Allied air power and fuel shortages. By October 1944, German commanders were abandoning tanks for lack of gasoline. In contrast, the Americans had built a mobile pipeline of men and machines that could adapt faster. Then the front line moved. Captured German reports later revealed disbelief at how quickly the U.S. forces recovered from their fuel crisis. One general, after interrogation, admitted, "We did not think the Americans could move so much, so fast. It was not their tanks we feared. It was their trucks." Behind that speed was discipline and improvisation. Mechanics had developed ingenious ways to stretch the fleet's lifespan. Salvaging parts from wrecks, repurposing captured German tires, even converting broken trucks into makeshift tankers. Drivers carried spare belts, cans of oil, and carburetor tools under their seats because breakdowns were daily reality. There were also the quiet acts of defiance and humanity. Drivers often risked court-martial by stopping to give food to French children along the road. They shared cigarettes with villagers, repaired local carts, and gave rides to refugees. For many of these soldiers who had grown up under Jim Crow segregation, France felt like the first place where they were seen simply as men doing their duty. Still, the strain was immense. Hundreds of drivers were killed or wounded in accidents, ambushes, or air attacks. Many were buried in unmarked graves along the same roads.